The moment the purge engaged, the air itself changed an almost inaudible thrum in the walls, a pressure shift that made Carter's ears pop and his already weakened lungs seize up. Warning lights strobed so fast they turned the room into a flickering nightmare. Vents along the ceiling opened with mechanical precision, and Carter caught the first sharp bite of something chemical before his body could fully register it. The facility wasn't improvising. This was a practiced, bureaucratic way to erase a problem. A room designed to become a coffin at the push of a button. She reacted faster than any human could. Her hand closed around Carter and yanked him tight against her torso. Not crushing, never crushing, but locking him in a pocket of space where her body became the barrier between him and everything else. She turned, shoulder first, into the oncoming seal as the blast shutters began to drop. Metal screamed against metal. The door frame shuddered. The shutters weren't meant to stop her. They were meant to stop anything from leaving once the purge began. She didn't hesitate. She slammed both palms into the descending barrier and stopped it mid-drop with raw force that made the motors whine in protest. Outside the transparent barrier, guards were spilling into the corridor, weapons raised, faces pale under the red wash. Voss was there, barking orders that weren't about killing, about disabling systems, about overriding protocols, about not letting this become a massacre. And then Harlow with his weapon and his fanatic certainty forcing his way toward the control panel like a man trying to light the fuse on a bomb he'd already committed to dying with. Carter's brain, still foggy from fever and adrenaline, did the only thing it could. It latched onto details. The vents were open. The shutter was dropping. The purge agent was already in the room. There wasn't time to argue with the facility. There was barely time to breathe. She lowered her head until her forehead nearly touched the barrier, amber eyes locking with Carter's through the strobing light as if checking him, counting breaths, reading the twitch of his throat, measuring how long a human could last in a room that had been weaponized. Then she made a sound, one low syllable that wasn't English, wasn't a growl, wasn't a scream. A command in her own language, and it carried the weight of a decision already made. She moved. With Carter pinned safely against her chest by one arm, she drove her free hand into the seam where wall met shutter mechanism. Her fingers didn't search, they knew where the weakness was, like she'd mapped this place the way she'd mapped the facility layout on her cell floor. She tore out a section of reinforced housing like ripping a panel off a cheap appliance, and the motors that controlled the blast shutter died in a shower of sparks. The heavy barrier sagged, stuck half down, half up, caught in a dead man's limbo. Then she leaned into it and lifted. The shutter rose just enough to make a savage, jagged gap. Not clean, not safe, but open. Open meant possible. Carter coughed, a harsh, involuntary bark, and she immediately shifted his face inward, turning him away from the vents and into her skin and the rough fabric of her prison garment. She wasn't just shielding him from bullets, she was shielding him from air itself. The realization hit him with a strange, dizzy clarity. She understood that he was fragile. Not in a pitying way. In a practical way. Like you understand glass when you've held it and don't want it to shatter. Move! Voss shouted through the chaos, voice cracking as another alarm tone layered over the others. Read Carter now. Harlow shoved past two guards and slammed his palm onto the emergency panel again, snarling override codes like prayers. Voss lunged for him. And for a second Carter saw the ugly shape of what Harlow had become, someone who decided the only way to be right was to make everyone else dead. The Giantess stepped through the half-raised shutter and into the corridor, and the world immediately made room for her in the only way it could, by panicking. Weapons snapped up. Stun batons hummed. Someone screamed a warning that didn't matter. She didn't attack. She didn't even look at most of them. Her focus was a straight line out, away, oxygen, space, safety. The way she moved through the corridor forced the guards to scatter like debris in a flood, not because she struck them, but because no one wants to be the thing that stops a living wall. A stun round hit her hip and splashed blue pain across her muscles. She flinched once, only once, and kept moving. Another hit her ribs. Another. She hissed, a sharp inhale that made her ridges flare, and Carter felt her grip tighten, not in anger, in warning. Stay still. Don't fall. Don't die. Behind them, the holding room's vent system howled, and the purge cycle shifted into its next phase. The air in the corridor started to thin, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The facility wasn't just gassing the room. It was changing pressure in the entire wing to keep anything from escaping. A containment strategy so ruthless it didn't care who it caught in the spillover. Voss saw it too. She snapped her communicator to her mouth. Seal section Delta. Hard close. If you don't, her words cut off as the ceiling lights strobed and dimmed, power routing to emergency systems. The Giantess stopped at an intersection where 3 corridors met, and Carter felt her hesitate for the first time. Her eyes flicked up to signage, symbols, colors, directions. This wasn't instinct. This was reading. And then she chose a path not random, not desperate correct. Carter's stomach turned as he recognized the direction. Not toward the medical bay, not toward the barracks. Toward the service spine, the ugly backbones of the facility where maintenance access, cargo elevators, and waste systems ran. The routes nobody watched unless something went wrong. The routes that existed because even secret prisons needed plumbing. She knows the way out, someone muttered, voice cracking with disbelief. No, Carter rasped, barely able to get air around the chemical sting and the panic. She knows the way around. The corridor narrowed, low pipes and conduit crisscrossing overhead. For her, it became a cage again. She ducked, shoulders scraping metal, and Carter heard the groan of stressed bolts as her mass forced the facility's skeleton to flex. Still, she didn't smash her way through like a berserker. She moved like someone who understood that breaking everything would bring the whole mountain down on top of them. They hit a security door thick, sealed, requiring clearance Carter didn't have and time they didn't possess. She didn't slow. She planted her feet, shifted Carter higher against her chest with a gentleness that was almost infuriating in the middle of a crisis, and then pressed her palms to the door. She didn't punch it. She peeled it. Metal shrieked as if it were alive. The locking bolts tore free, one after another, and the door bowed outward until its frame gave up. She pulled it open and stepped through into a service bay filled with stacked crates and maintenance equipment, everything lit by emergency strips that painted the world in thin, sickly white. Carter's vision blurred. His lungs burned. He realized with a cold, sick drop that the purge wasn't just about containment anymore. Someone had escalated it. Someone wanted this wing dead, everyone inside it, as long as the specimen and the compromised guard went with it. Harlow. Of course it was Harlow. In the service bay, she finally set Carter down carefully, with both hands, lowering him behind a heavy equipment console like she'd seen humans take cover. She crouched, big enough that even crouching she could block half the room, and she touched his face with the back of her fingers, checking his temperature, his breathing, the tremor in his jaw. Carter tried to speak, to tell her to run, to leave him because he was dead weight, but her gaze pinned him into silence. "Yours," she started, then paused like she was pulling the words up through broken ground. "Mine." The way she said it wasn't romantic. It wasn't a playful claim. It was a vow spoken by something that measured life in debts and choices and survival. He fed her when no one would. She carried him when no one else did. Now the ledger was written into her bones, and she wasn't going to let anyone erase it. "Yeah," Carter croaked, forcing air through pain. "I got the message." A sound, almost a breath of amusement, escaped her, so small it barely counted as laughter. Then it vanished as new noise flooded in. Boots shouting, the mechanical thump of more blast doors sealing off routes. They were trying to box her in, turn the facility into a puzzle with no solution. She stood, and Carter felt the air move with her. She looked around the bay, eyes catching on a thick pipe run labeled with hazard markings. Waste, ventilation, pressure regulation, the kind of systems that didn't care about badges. She grabbed the pipe at shoulder height and yanked. The entire run shuddered. Bolts snapped. A coupling broke loose with a violent hiss, and a gust of colder, cleaner air punched into the bay. It wasn't perfect oxygen, but it wasn't purge stink either. She held the gap open with brute strength and angled her body between the source and Carter like she was building him alone out of her own muscles. Then she moved again fast, decisive, tore open a maintenance hatch, ripped free the grating, and revealed a vertical shaft just barely wide enough for a human to climb and absolutely not wide enough for her to fit unless she made it fit. Carter stared up into darkness, seeing the faintest hint of moonlight through grills far above. Surface access. A vent stack. A service chimney. "You first," he rasped. She shook her head once, sharp and final. She grabbed him by the harness of his hospital gown and lifted him like he weighed nothing, pushing him up toward the opening with a precision that made it clear she'd watched humans climb ladders before. Carter caught the edges, grimaced, and hauled himself into the shaft with shaking arms. Below him, she looked up, eyes bright in the emergency light, and for a second the chaos softened into something like a private moment in the middle of a war. Not tenderness. Recognition. The fact that two living things had decided against rules, against fear, against the facility itself, that they were not going to be separated. Then she wedged her hands into the shaft sides and pulled. The metal screamed. The shaft widened, not gracefully but enough. She forced her shoulders in, ridges scraping, and Carter felt the entire structure tremble. Somewhere behind them, guards shouted that they were losing them. Somewhere else, a system warning escalated into the kind of tone you heard right before something catastrophic happened. And then, just as Carter started climbing, the facility itself took a breath and began to die. Power flickered. The emergency strips went out for half a second, came back dimmer. The air thinned again. The purge had moved from a single room to a full-wing sterilization. Harlow's final tantrum. A last attempt to be the hero of his own story by burning down the world that wouldn't applaud him. Carter climbed, hands slipping on metal slick with condensation, coughing hard enough he tasted blood. Below him, she climbed in a way that defied physics, hands and feet finding purchase where none should exist, body folding into angles that made no sense for something her size. Every time he faltered, he felt the shaft vibrate as her hand came up beneath him, not pushing him, just there, a floor where there shouldn't be one. Minutes stretched into a lifetime. The air grew colder. The stink of chemicals faded into damp, mineral wind. The faintest hint of outside of dirt, of rain, of something that wasn't scrubbed and filtered hit Carter like a hallucination. At the top, a grill. Carter slammed his shoulder into it once, twice, pain flaring, until it snapped free and clattered into darkness beyond. He hauled himself up and out onto a rocky slope hidden behind a stand of scrub and broken stone. Night air hit him full in the face, and he sucked it in like a starving man. Below, the shaft shuddered again, and then her head emerged, then shoulders, then that enormous frame forcing itself into the outside world like a myth crawling out of a hole humans never should have dug. She rose to her full height under the open sky, and for a second she just stood there, breathing, ridges lifted as if her body couldn't quite believe the ceiling was gone. Inside the mountain behind them, alarms wailed, distant and muffled now, like a dying animal. Carter collapsed onto the cold ground, chest heaving. He looked up at her through blurred vision. She looked down at him, amber eyes steady, unblinking, and the harsh red emergency light from the vent shaft painted the underside of her jaw like war paint. "They will come," she said, voice stronger now that she wasn't trapped in a box designed to break her. "Not a warning, a fact." "I know," Carter wheezed. "We're not exactly subtle." She crouched, lowering herself until her face was closer, still massive, still alien, but no longer framed by reinforced glass and hatred. Then she reached out and touched his shoulder with one finger, gentle enough that it felt like a promise rather than a claim. "You fed me," she said again, slower this time, as if the words were important enough to carve into the night. "Now you do not leave." Carter should have argued, should have corrected the possessive, demanded boundaries, reminded her that humans didn't belong to anyone. But he heard the alarms fading behind them, felt the cold air in his lungs, and understood the plain truth. There was no going back to being just a guard. The facility would call him traitor. The council would call him compromised. Harlow would call him proof that mercy was weakness. And she would call him what she decided he was the first time he slid food through a slot and didn't pull away when her fingers brushed his. Carter wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, tasted blood, and managed a crooked, exhausted breath that almost passed for a laugh. "All right," he rasped. "Then we move. Before they decide to turn the whole mountain into a crater." She rose, and the night seemed to shrink around her, like the world itself didn't know what to do with something her size that refused to stay hidden. She looked toward the horizon, listening not with ears, but with a predator's entire body. Then she extended her hand, not grabbing, offering. Carter stared at it, at the massive palm that could break him and had chosen, over and over, not to. He reached up and took it. Her fingers closed around his hand, warm and steady, and she pulled him to his feet like he was nothing, like he mattered anyway. Behind them, deep inside the facility, something heavy detonated, either a system failing or someone making sure there'd be nothing left to investigate. A bloom of orange briefly lit the cloud cover above the ridge. The place that had tried to starve her, break her, erase her, was burning itself down. She didn't look back. Carter did, once, and felt a cold clarity settle in his bones. This wasn't an escape story. This was the start of a hunt. And whether he liked her words or not, whether he was ready or not, she had made her choice in the only language the facility ever respected: action. He squeezed her finger as tightly as his weak hand could manage. "Let's go," he said. And together they stepped into the dark, with the alarms behind them and the unknown ahead, and the unspoken certainty between them that whatever came next, she wasn't letting him be taken again. The forest swallowed sound the way the facility had swallowed light, greedy, indifferent, absolute. The difference was the air. The cold night air didn't taste like bleach and metal, it tasted like wet pine, loam, and the faint mineral sting of rock. Carter clung to it like it was medicine. Every breath still hurt, but it hurt in a way that meant he was alive and outside and not being processed by a protocol written by cowards. She didn't move like a fugitive. She moved like an animal that had finally remembered the size of its territory. Long strides that ate ground, head angling as she listened through the trees and under the wind, hair streaming behind her like a banner that had never belonged to anyone. She kept Carter close without needing to haul him, letting him use her hand as a moving rail when the terrain got rough. When his boots slid on slick stone, her fingers tightened and pulled him back upright with that same maddening control, never yanking hard enough to hurt, never loosening enough for him to fall. Mine. The word sat in his ribs like a lodged bullet, not because he believed it, but because she did. They didn't get far before the sky began to change. It wasn't the sunrise still hours away, it was the search pattern. Distant rotors beat the air in low, overlapping pulses, and then a pale cone of light swept across the tree line from far behind them. Helicopters. Thermal. Night vision. The facility might be burning, but it wasn't dead. It was a wounded beast calling the pack. Carter's mind tried to assemble a plan and kept coming up empty. He had no radio, no supplies, no map, a fever that made his thoughts float away when he needed them most, and a giant alien woman who could peel doors off hinges and had decided that letting him go was not an option. She stopped on a ridge where the forest thinned and the rock broke through like bone. Below, the land fell into a narrow ravine cut by an old creek, black water glinting where the moon found it. She crouched, pressing her palm to the ground. Carter didn't understand the gesture until he felt it. The faint tremor of engines through stone, the vibration of vehicles moving on a service road somewhere down the slope. They were already deploying ground teams. She looked back at him and said a single word in her language, sharp as flint. Then she pointed at his chest, then at the ravine. Down, Carter translated, voice rough. You want us down there? Her eyes narrowed in approval, not because he was right, but because he was trying. She shifted, scooped him up again, this time without ceremony because there wasn't time, and slid down the ravine wall like gravity was optional. Carter's stomach lurched. He grabbed her wrist with both hands and focused on not vomiting. In 2 heartbeats they were at the bottom, and the world above them was nothing but roots and shadow. The creek stank of iron and rot, but it was water, and water meant a chance to cover their scent and break thermal patterns. She stepped into it and waded upstream, keeping to the deepest channel so the water lapped at her thighs. Carter stumbled beside her, boots filling, legs shaking, then she hooked 2 fingers into the back of his collar and steadied him like a child learning to walk. The indignation tried to rise. It didn't have enough oxygen. A searchlight swept the ridge above, white against the trees. A voice, amplified, tinny, echoed from somewhere distant. The kind of call-out you used when you wanted to pretend this was still an orderly arrest and not a hunt. Comply and you will not be harmed. Carter barked a laugh that turned into a cough. That's cute. She didn't laugh. She watched the light, then glanced down at Carter as if checking the sound he'd made, and then she pressed 2 fingers gently to his throat. Not choking. Feeling the vibration as he swallowed, as he tried to breathe quietly. Her gaze sharpened. She drew her hand back and made a gesture. 2 fingers to her mouth, then a fist closing. Silent. I get it, Carter rasped. I'm working on it. They moved for what felt like hours but might have been minutes, the creek bending and folding through the ravine. The helicopters drifted closer, then farther, sweeping patterns that didn't commit because they couldn't pinpoint. Twice, they heard dogs, real dogs, the sharp bark and frantic yelp echoing off stone. Carter's heart sank at the sound. You didn't bring dogs unless you planned to find someone bleeding. His sleeve was soaked. He didn't remember when he'd torn it. He just knew the cold kept seeping in and his joints were turning stiff. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She stopped beneath an overhang where the ravine widened into a small alcove and guided him onto a shelf of stone out of the water. Then she cupped his face in her hands and forced him to look at her. Her eyes were luminous in the dark, not glowing like a flashlight, but catching every scrap of light and returning it. She spoke slowly, shaping words she'd stolen from listening. Carter hurt. He swallowed. Yeah. She tilted her head, and something in her expression changed, frustration, maybe, or a kind of impatience with the limitations of flesh. She took her torn jumpsuit and ripped a strip from it with one easy motion, then wrapped it around his forearm with surprising skill. Tight enough to compress, loose enough not to cut off circulation. She tied it off and pressed her thumb into the knot until she was satisfied. Then she did something that made Carter's stomach twist harder than the climb had. She bent, brought her face close to his, and inhaled once, long and slow, over the bandage and up his sleeve, like she was cataloging him. Like she was making sure she could find him in the dark if they were separated. Like his scent was information. Carter flinched despite himself. "Don't," she froze, eyes snapping up. The pause was sharp, tense, like a predator halting mid-strike. Not anger. Confusion. He realized she wasn't reading his discomfort as a boundary. She was reading it as a threat to something she considered necessary. He forced himself to breathe and tried again, using the only tool he had. Simple words. "I'm not prey. I'm not property." Her gaze flickered. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, very carefully, "Not prey. A beat. Not food. Another beat. Mine." Carter's jaw clenched. That one too. She didn't have the words for the argument he wanted to have. She had a life of cages and handlers and menus and pain, and she had one human who broke the pattern by feeding her without a hook in it. In her mind, that wasn't kindness. That was bond. Claim. A rope thrown across an abyss that she had grabbed with both hands and refused to release. He wasn't going to talk her out of it in a ravine while searchlights swept overhead. He rubbed at his eyes, smearing grime across his brow. "Look," he whispered, "we can fight about vocabulary later. Right now we need distance." She watched his mouth as if trying to store the shape of the phrase. Then she nodded once, decisive. Distance. That, at least, was a concept she understood. She crouched lower under the overhang, pulling her bulk into shadow until she was almost invisible despite her size. Carter realized she wasn't just hiding, she was making a shelter. Her body blocked the wind. Her hair fell forward like a curtain. The alcove became a pocket of warmer air behind her ribs. He hated how much his body wanted it. He hated how it felt to rely on her. And he hated, more than either, the part of him that recognized the irony. The facility called her the monster, and she was the only reason he wasn't dead. Above them, the ravine mouth flickered with light. Voices got closer. Boots on rock. A handler calling to a dog. Carter's pulse hammered. He leaned toward the back wall, trying to make himself smaller, and felt her hand slide behind him, flat against stone, blocking him from the world like an armored door. The dog's bark echoed again. Then came the scrabble of claws on rock as it descended somewhere nearby. Carter could hear it now, smell it. Wet fur. Mud. Blood. The giantess's posture changed. Her shoulders rose. The ridges along her neck lifted slightly, a silent bristle. She was poised on the edge of violence with the kind of restraint that made it more terrifying. If she attacked, it would be quick and absolute. If she didn't, the dog would lead them right here. Carter's mind flashed to the guards he'd known, the ones who weren't Harlow, people with families, with jokes, with bad coffee breath. He didn't want to slaughter. He didn't want to be the trigger for it. He swallowed hard and reached up, touching the back of her hand with his fingertips. Not pulling, not pushing, just contact. Her head turned a fraction, eyes cutting down to him. "Don't," he breathed. The word came out as a plea he didn't want to give. "Not unless you have to." Her nostrils flared. She looked toward the ravine mouth again, then back to Carter. A calculation moved behind her eyes, cold and precise. The odds of escape versus the odds of exposure versus the cost of restraint. For a long second, he thought she would ignore him. Then she did something else. She reached into the darkness behind her and pulled free a chunk of rock the size of a microwave. The movement was soundless. She shifted her grip, then, without looking, tossed it up the ravine in the opposite direction with a casual, controlled arc. It landed with a heavy, cracking smash that echoed like a cave-in. The dog went berserk. Its bark became frantic, and Carter heard the handler shout, heard Boots scramble toward the noise. The light swept away. The voices followed. The ravine mouth went dark again. Carter sagged, the relief almost making him dizzy. "Okay," he whispered. "That was good." She looked at him as if waiting for judgment. When he met her eyes and nodded, something eased in her shoulders. Not pride. Something closer to trust. Like she'd taken his input and waited as legitimate. That terrified him in a different way, because it meant his influence mattered. And if his influence mattered, so did his mistakes. They stayed under the overhang until the search sounds faded into distance and the ravine returned to its natural quiet. Carter's body started to tremble from cold and delayed shock. She noticed again, because she noticed everything about him, and she shifted closer, lowering her torso until her chest and shoulder formed a windbreak. Then she reached down and lifted him, not to restrain this time, but to place him against her side like a person would place a hot water bottle. He stiffened. "I'm fine." Her eyes narrowed, unimpressed. "Liar." The word hit him like a slap because it was so clean, so correctly used. He stared at her. Where did you?" She tapped her temple, then pointed behind them in the direction of the mountain. "Listen," she said. "Always." "You talk." "They talk." "I learn." Carter let out a slow breath. "Great. So you learned the language of the people who tortured you." She didn't answer that. She stared out into the ravine, jaw tight, as if the question had teeth. Then she spoke, softly, almost to herself. "Not all talk bad." And then, after a pause, she touched Carter's chest again with 2 fingers. "You. Not bad." The simplicity of it made something in Carter's throat ache more than the chemicals had. He looked away because he didn't trust his face to stay neutral. Above, the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, just a pale, bruised gray bleeding into the treetops. Dawn meant visibility. Visibility meant thermal was less decisive, but optics got better. It meant more teams, more drones, more sweep lines. They had to move. Carter forced his legs to work, and she let him, only intervening when he stumbled. They followed the creek until it widened and spilled into a marshy flat where the ground turned soft and full of reeds. The helicopter noise returned, closer now, and Carter saw it, tiny lights between trees, the glide of a drone like an insect with a camera. She saw it too. She moved without hesitation, stepped into the reed bed, and pushed down. The earth gave under her weight, water swallowing her calves, then knees, then waist. For a heartbeat, Carter panicked, until he realized she wasn't sinking accidentally. She was deliberately submerging to break line of sight. She grabbed Carter and pulled him down with her, not under, but into the shelter of reeds and muddy water up to his chest. The cold punched him like a fist. He gasped and nearly choked, and her hand clamped over his mouth, not to silence him cruelly, but to stop the sound from carrying. The drone buzzed overhead, its faint whine slicing through the reeds. Carter's heart pounded. He watched the thin sky through gaps and stalks, watched the drone hover, tilt, as if deciding. Her body was a dark shape in the water, still as a rock, eyes fixed upward. A statue that could rip steel, choosing to be mud. The drone drifted, hovered again, then moved on. Only when the sound faded did she lift her hand from Carter's mouth. He sucked air in ragged pulls. "You almost killed me," he hissed. She stared at him, then said, deadpan, "Not kill. Save." Carter swallowed another cough. Debatable. She didn't argue. She grabbed a handful of black mud and smeared it across Carter's cheekbone, then his neck, then the back of his hands. Carter recoiled at first, then realized what she was doing. Thermal masking. Breaking up shine. Hiding skin tone. She was applying camouflage like she'd done it before. He stared at her hands, mud slick and careful, and felt his stomach twist again. "How many times did you escape?" he whispered. She paused. Her eyes went distant. Then she held up one finger. Lowered it. Held up 2. Lowered it. Held up 3. 3, Carter breathed. Her face tightened. 3 fail. Carter's voice went hoarse. "Not this time." She watched him for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, as if it cost her to admit it, "With you not fail." Mine, wrapped in a different skin. He didn't have the strength to correct her again. He just nodded, because the alternative, arguing philosophy while they were half submerged in a swamp, was insane. They moved again when the drone's sound was gone, pushing through reeds until the marsh gave way to higher ground dotted with boulders and deadfall. The sun rose behind thick cloud, the light flat and cold. In that gray daylight, Carter could see her more clearly. The bruises blooming under her skin where stun rounds had hit, the raw scrapes where metal had cut her climbing out, the exhaustion and the slight tremor of her fingers when she thought he wasn't watching. She wasn't invincible. She was just bigger. That mattered, because a bigger target bleeds more. They reached a stand of older trees where the undergrowth grew dense and tangled. She stopped and looked ahead. Carter followed her gaze and saw it, an abandoned structure, half collapsed, maybe an old ranger station or hunting cabin, swallowed by forest and time. The roof sagged, and the windows were broken, but it was shelter. It was also a trap if anyone else knew it existed. She moved toward it cautiously, head low. Carter stumbled along behind, leaning on her hand like it was a railing in a storm. Inside, the cabin smelled like mold and old smoke. The floorboards creaked. Animal droppings littered the corners. But it was enclosed. It was out of the wind. She ducked and squeezed in, then immediately turned and used her body to block the doorway while Carter collapsed against an interior wall. He slid down and sat hard, breathing like his lungs were full of glass. She studied the cabin the way she'd studied the facility, looking for threats, exits, structural weaknesses. Then she went to the far wall and peeled away rotten boards until she had a sightline out without exposing them. She settled with her back to the wall like a living barricade. Carter tried to get his mind to work. We need food. Water. A way to. He stopped because the obvious problem slammed into him. We need to disappear, and you're big, she supplied. He blinked. Yeah. Vague. She looked faintly amused again, and it was unsettling how human the expression seemed. You small. Thanks. She shifted, and the cabin creaked under her weight. She reached into a corner and pulled out something Carter hadn't noticed, a battered metal box, the kind hunters kept supplies in. She pried it open and dumped its contents onto the floor. A few corroded cans, old rope, a cracked flashlight, and, miracle of miracles, a thermal blanket in crinkled foil packaging. Carter stared. No way. She handed him the blanket like it was a trophy. Look. He ripped it open with shaking hands and wrapped it around his shoulders. The warmth was psychological more than physical, but it helped. He looked up at her. You realize they're going to track us here eventually. She nodded. Yes. And if they corner us, they will shoot you until you fall. Her eyes hardened. Yes. And you're still. He stopped himself before he said mine. He didn't want to put the word in the air again. She finished it anyway. Still keep. Carter closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. I didn't feed you so you die for me. Her voice came softer, but no less absolute. I did not ask. That's not how. He broke off. Because he didn't have a clean way to explain consent to someone who'd been handled like equipment. He forced himself to sit up straighter. Listen. If we're going to survive, we need rules. Real ones. Not instincts. She watched him. Patient. Alert. Like she was deciding whether rules were another kind of cage. Carter held her gaze. Rule 1. You don't hurt people unless you have to. Only if they're going to kill us. A long pause. Then a slow nod. Rule 2. If I say stop, you stop. Even if you don't understand why. You trust me. Her eyes narrowed, weighing. Then another nod, smaller this time, but real. Rule 3, Carter said, and his throat tightened because he knew this was the one that mattered most. I'm not yours. I'm with you because I choose to be. If I ever choose not to be, you let me go. Silence filled the cabin. Outside, a bird called once, sharp and lonely. She didn't nod. Her jaw flexed. Her eyes flickered with something like fear, raw and unexpected. Carter realized, with a cold rush, that the idea of letting him go wasn't just unpleasant to her. It was existential. It was the same abyss as starvation. The same emptiness as the cage. He was a tether she'd grabbed in the dark, and he was asking her to release it. Carter swallowed. I'm not trying to leave, he said quickly, honest as a blade. Not now. But if we're going to do this without it turning into something ugly, that has to be true. She stared at him like the words were a lock she didn't have the key to. Then she said, very slowly, if you go they take. Maybe, Carter admitted. But if you keep me against my will, you become them. That landed. He saw it in her face, the flinch, the recoil, like he'd shown her a mirror she didn't want to look into. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she looked down at her hands, mud still cracked across her knuckles, bruises darkening. She took a breath, and her voice came out rough. Not them. Carter's shoulders loosened a fraction. Then we agree. She looked back up at him, eyes steady again. You choose. He nodded. I choose. Her gaze didn't soften, but something inside it settled, like a storm finding a basin. Then she extended her hand again, not grasping, not claiming, just open. Carter hesitated, then placed his hand against her palm. The contact was absurd, the scale mismatch, the heat difference, but it was also the first time it felt like a gesture instead of a restraint. Her fingers curled slightly, not trapping, just holding. Outside, far off, the thump of rotors returned, distant but persistent. Somewhere out there, Voss would be fighting to keep this from turning into a slaughter, if she was still alive. Somewhere out there, Carlo would be either dead in the burning facility or alive and sharpening his righteous hatred into a blade. Carter stared at the cabin's broken window and the gray woods beyond. He felt small and hunted and sick. He also felt, against all logic, a sliver of something like direction. "We move after dark," he said. "We follow water, stay off ridgelines, avoid open sky. If we can find a road, an actual road, we steal supplies. We need a radio. We need a phone. We need," she listened, head tilted, absorbing every word like it mattered because he said it. Carter swallowed and forced the next part out. "And we need a name for you that isn't Specimen or Giantess. Something you choose." Her eyes widened slightly. The concept hit like a gift she didn't know existed. She looked away, thinking, and for a moment she seemed younger, less like a weapon and more like someone who'd been denied basic things for so long she didn't trust them. Then she spoke a sound, 2 syllables, soft but firm, like stone in water. "Sail." Carter repeated it, careful. "Sail." She nodded once, satisfied. "Okay," Carter said, voice steadier than he felt. "Sail." "I'm Carter. We're going to get out of this alive." Sail leaned closer and her voice dropped into something almost intimate, not romantic, not gentle, but private. "Alive," she echoed. Then, as if testing a new shape in her mouth, she added, "together." Carter didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, at the bruises and the quiet ferocity, at the way she'd chosen mud and silence over blood because he asked her to. He didn't know what the next day would bring, only that it would bring pursuit, hunger, cold, and choices that would hurt no matter what. But for the first time since the purge alarms had begun, he felt something that wasn't just fear. He squeezed her palm once, small pressure against a giant hand, and said the only true thing he had left. Together. Night didn't fall so much as sink in, a slow drowning of the gray world until the forest became a mass of shapes and listening. The cabin creaked with every shift of wind. Carter dozed in splinters, waking every few minutes when his fever spiked, and the inside of his skull flashed hot, then cooling into chills so hard his teeth clicked. Each time he jolted awake, Sail was there, still, awake, watching the same narrow slit she'd made in the boards. No pacing, no fidgeting. Just presence, like a boulder that had decided to stand guard. At one point he woke to the faint crackle of radio chatter drifting through the trees. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Search teams. Organized. Patient. Close. Carter pushed himself upright, joints screaming. "They're circling," he whispered. Sail's head turned slightly, as if she'd been waiting for him to notice. She held up a finger, one, then moved it slowly in a looping motion. "Encircle." Then she pointed at Carter and drew her thumb down across her own throat in a clean, sharp line. He stared. "If they catch me, I'm dead." Sail's eyes narrowed, and she pointed at herself, then made the same gesture again, but this time she dragged her thumb across her throat and then snapped her hand outward like throwing something away. Carter swallowed. "And if they catch you, they'll kill you too." Her mouth tightened. She made a different gesture, 2 fingers tapping her own chest, then tapping Carter's. Then her fist clenched and she twisted it like breaking a chain. Not the same. Not equal. But together. Carter rubbed his face, smearing dried mud and exhaustion across his palm. "All right," he breathed. "We move." Sail didn't scoop him up immediately. Instead she crouched and reached behind the cabin wall, pulling free the coil of old rope. She tested it, yanking hard enough that it should have snapped. It didn't. Then she tore the rope in half with a quick jerk and handed one length to Carter. He frowned. "What?" She wrapped the other half around her own wrist, then offered the loose end to him. It was a leash. A tether. A solution to the worst-case scenario: darkness, pursuit, panic, separation. Carter stared at it, anger flaring hot in his throat and then dying under the weight of practicality. In the dark, with his fever and her size, if he fell behind or got turned around, he'd be gone. She wasn't trying to own him. Not right now. She was trying to not lose him. He took the rope and looped it around his forearm once, then tied it in a way he could undo quickly. "This isn't permanent," he said. Sail's gaze held his. Then she nodded, almost impatient. "Move!" They slipped out the back of the cabin like thieves leaving a bad dream, into brush thick enough to scratch skin and snag cloth. Sail moved low and quiet for something that could uproot trees. Her feet placed carefully, weight distributed, stepping where the ground was firm. Carter followed, tugged along just enough to keep pace, lungs burning with every uphill push. The first hour was pure endurance. The second was calculation. Carter forced his mind into the shape of maps he didn't have. The facility had been in mountainous terrain, remote but not impossible. There would be forestry roads, service roads, maybe even a small town if they were within an hour's drive of anything. The problem was sail. Even in darkness, her outline against the sky was wrong. She needed canopy and shadow. She needed roots that hid something too large to belong. They followed a game trail that cut along the spine of a hill rather than the crest, staying in the trees. Sail paused often, not from fatigue, but to listen. Twice she froze so suddenly Carter nearly walked into her calf. Each time, the reason came a heartbeat later. Distant voices, a dog's bark, the faint whir of a drone. At one point, the rope went slack as she stopped and crouched. Carter felt her fingers touch the tether and then draw it toward her, shortening it. He started to protest, and then he heard it too. Human footsteps ahead. Close. Sail pulled Carter behind a fallen log, then pressed her body flat into the brush. She shouldn't have been able to disappear like that. But she did, folding herself into the terrain until she was just a deeper shadow under the trees. Two men passed on the trail 20 yards away, headlamps on low red. Their rifles hung ready. Their voices were hushed but tense. Voss says we're not to engage unless we have a clear shot, the first whispered. Voss can kiss my ass, the second muttered. That thing's killed people. It hasn't, the first said, and there was fatigue in it. Harlow's the one who, a crackle from a radio cut him off. A voice, clipped and cold, spilled out. Team 3, report. Any contact? No contact, the first man answered, swallowing the rest of his sentence. Negative visual. Negative thermal. Continue sweep. Remember, you are authorized to neutralize the asset and the accomplice on site. The second man grunted. There it is. Accomplice. Their footsteps faded. Carter lay behind the log, heart-punching his ribs, and stared into the dark where Sail's eyes watched him. Accomplice. That meant Voss either couldn't stop the order or wasn't in command anymore. Carter's mouth went dry. They want us dead, he whispered. Sail didn't answer with words. She reached under the brush and gripped Carter's forearm with a steady pressure that said, very clearly, I already knew. They moved again, faster now. Sail led them toward lower elevation, toward the sound of water, then away from it, following the logic of concealment rather than direction. Carter's legs were lead. His fever made the forest tilt and breathe. Several times he tripped and would have face-planted if the tether hadn't snapped taut and pulled him upright. After what felt like a lifetime, they reached a break in the trees. Ahead, through a lattice of branches, Carter saw faint sodium light, orange and steady, the unmistakable glow of a road. Sail stopped at the edge of the tree line and stared. The open strip of asphalt was a wound in the forest, exposed to sky. A trap if there were drones. A gift if there weren't. Carter licked cracked lips. We need supplies, he whispered. Food. Water. Something to treat this. He gestured vaguely at himself. And a way to call someone who isn't trying to kill us. Sail glanced down at him, then back at the road. Her nostrils flared. She was scenting the air like an animal, testing for smoke, sweat, fuel, fear. Then she pointed, not to the road itself, but to something beyond it, down the slope, where a small parking lot sat beside a maintenance shed. Two vehicles. One dark SUV. One white utility truck with a logo Carter couldn't read at this distance. Truck, Carter whispered. If it's a utility truck, it might have. His brain clicked into survival inventory. First aid kit. Tools. Maybe a radio. Or at least a charger. Sail made a short motion with her hand, yes. Then she did something that made Carter's stomach drop. She pointed to herself, then made the gun gesture with her fingers, then pointed toward the lot. Then she pointed to Carter and made a flat palm motion downward. Stay. No, Carter whispered immediately. No. If you go down there alone and something goes wrong. Sail's eyes sharpened. She touched his chest, 2 fingers, firm, and then pressed those fingers against her own. A pause. Then she pointed to the lot again and made a sweeping motion like clearing. She wasn't asking permission. She was telling him what she intended. She would take the risk because she could survive it better than he could. Carter hated that she was right. He grabbed her wrist. If I'm staying, you're staying in sight. You don't vanish. You come back. That's a rule. Sail stared at his hand on her wrist for a second, then she nodded once. Her gaze softened just enough to be dangerous. Rule, she repeated, like locking the word into place. Then she slipped away. Carter crouched deeper into brush, every nerve screaming. He watched the lot through branches as Sail moved downhill. In the dim light she was a shadow among shadows until she crossed a patch of exposed ground and her size became obvious. She timed it with the passing of cloud cover over the moon, using darkness like a curtain. She reached the edge of the lot and froze. Carter saw her head tilt. Then very slowly she lowered herself behind the maintenance shed. A human shape stepped out from the shed's side door. A man in a jacket with reflective strips, probably maintenance or utility. He carried a thermos. He looked half asleep, not a soldier. He took a sip and stared out at the trees like he was thinking about nothing. Then his head snapped toward the shed. Sail rose just enough for him to see her. The man froze, thermos slipping from his hand. It hit the asphalt with a hollow thunk. Carter's pulse spiked. The man opened his mouth. Sail moved faster than Carter's eyes could track. Not charging. Not lunging. She covered the distance and, miracle, didn't strike him. She reached out and clapped a hand over his mouth, pinning him gently against the shed wall like a child being shushed. With her other hand she pointed at his chest and then up toward the road, then made the same throat-cut gesture she'd shown Carter earlier. Don't shout, or you die. Not by me, by what comes next. The man's eyes bulged with terror. He nodded frantically. Sail released his mouth slightly, just enough for him to breathe, and then she did something Carter didn't expect at all. She tapped her own chest, then tapped Carter's, and then held up both palms in a calming motion. Not here to kill. Need help. The man stared at her, shaking. Then his gaze flicked up the slope, toward the trees where Carter hid, and Sail's head snapped to follow it. She pointed sharply at the trees and then held up a fist. Stay put. Carter mouthed a curse and stayed put. Sail turned back to the man and pointed at the utility truck. She mimed opening the door, then mimed handing something over. Then she pointed at his pocket and mimed a phone. The man swallowed hard, eyes darting. He was deciding whether this was a hallucination, a prank, or the last seconds of his life. Then he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, holding it like a shield. Sail shook her head sharply and pointed at the road, then made a circling motion. Search teams. Then she pointed at the man and made a quiet motion again. No call. Not now. The man nodded again, trembling. Sail gestured at the truck. The man fumbled for keys and moved like he was wading through a dream. He unlocked the utility truck and opened the cab. Sail stepped back, keeping her body between him and the tree line like she was shielding him from the world, not threatening him. He grabbed a bright orange case from behind the seat, first aid. He held it up, and Sail took it with fingers gentle enough not to crush plastic. Then she pointed at the SUV. The man's breath hitched. And no, he whispered, voice barely audible. That's Sail's eyes narrowed. She pointed again, more insistent. The man swallowed and shook his head. That's government, he whispered. They're inside. Carter's blood went cold. Sail froze completely. Her head turned slowly toward the SUV. The vehicle sat dark, windows tinted, engine off. But as she stared, a tiny red dot blinked near the rear view, an interior sensor. A camera. A recording. Sail's posture changed. It was subtle, but absolute. The calm was gone. The predator was awake. She looked up the slope. Her eyes met Carter's through the trees. And Carter knew, in that instant, that this moment was the fork. If Sail panicked, she would tear the lot apart and bodies would fall like broken dolls. If she hesitated, they would be seen, recorded, and boxed in before dawn. Carter forced his legs to move. He broke cover and half ran, half stumbled down the slope, ignoring the screaming protests of his lungs. Sail's eyes widened as he approached. She stepped toward him as if to intercept, to stop him from entering open ground. Sail! Carter hissed, breathless. Listen to me. Her jaw flexed. She glanced at the SUV again, then back at Carter, and for a heartbeat he saw raw fear in her, not fear of dying, but fear of being caged again. Fear that made violence feel like the only door. Carter grabbed her wrist, both hands this time. Rule 1, he said, forcing the words out like anchors. Unless you have to. Her gaze locked onto him. He swallowed, then pointed at the SUV. That's a problem. But it isn't an immediate kill problem. Not yet. Sail's nostrils flared. She leaned in, close enough that her breath warmed his face. They take, she said, voice low. I know, Carter said, and his voice cracked. I know what they do. But if you smash that SUV, you light the whole forest up. Then every team within 5 miles converges. If we slip away with supplies, we stay ghosts. Sale stared at him, trembling with restrained force. Carter turned to the maintenance man, who looked like he might faint. "What's your name?" Carter asked, voice harsh. The man blinked. Tom. Tom, Carter said. "Do you have a radio? Anything in that truck?" Tom nodded frantically. "Why, yeah. Work radio." It's not. Give it," Carter said. Tom scrambled and shoved a handheld radio toward him. Carter took it, thumbed it on, and listened. Static, then a clipped voice. Asset sighting road 12 possible visual. Carter's stomach dropped. They were already narrowing the net. He looked at Sale. "We take the kit, we take the radio, and we leave now." Sale didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the SUV. The red dot blinked again. Then the SUV's driver's side door cracked open. A man stepped out, tall, armored, helmeted. His weapon came up in one fluid motion. He didn't shout. He didn't warn. He simply aimed at Carter like Carter was a target on a range. Carter's hands went up instinctively. "Don't!" exclamation. Sale moved. Not at the man, at Carter. She snatched him up and pivoted, her body turning between him and the muzzle. The shot rang out, sharp and flat, and Carter felt the impact through her, like someone had punched a wall beside his head. Sale flinched, a small jerk, and a dark stain spread across her shoulder. For one heartbeat, everything froze. Then Sale's eyes went incandescent with something old and violent. Carter grabbed her face with both hands, absurd, like trying to hold back a storm with fingers. "Sale!" he shouted, voice cracking. "Rule 1. Rule 1. Her gaze snapped to him. For a fraction of a second, she hesitated. Just long enough for the soldier to fire again. Sale's hand whipped out, not striking the soldier's body, but striking the weapon itself. She slapped it sideways with enough force to send it clattering across asphalt. Then she lunged forward and grabbed the soldier by the vest and lifted him off the ground like he weighed nothing. The soldier thrashed, reaching for a sidearm. Sale's lips pulled back, ridges flaring, teeth bared. Carter, dangling in her other arm, choked on panic. "Sale, don't!" exclamation. Her grip tightened on the soldier. The man's boots kicked in the air. His helmet knocked against her knuckles. She could end him in a second. Instead, she did something terrifyingly controlled. She slammed him into the side of the SUV hard enough to dent metal and rattle the glass, then pinned him there, her hand around his throat, not crushing, just locking him in place. She leaned in until her face was inches from his visor. And she spoke in her language, voice like a blade being drawn. The soldier went still. Carter didn't know what she said, but he knew the effect. It wasn't just threat. It was declaration. A promise. A boundary carved into air. Then Sale released him. The soldier dropped to his knees, gasping, scrambling backward, eyes wild behind the visor. Sale stepped back, clutching her wounded shoulder, breathing hard. She looked down at Carter in her arm, eyes still burning. Carter met her gaze, swallowing blood and fear. "We leave," he said, quieter now, the words ragged. "Now." Sale's jaw worked. The predator wanted to finish. The survivor wanted to flee. The bond, whatever it was, pulled her toward Carter's voice. She turned. Tom let out a broken sound, half sob, half prayer, and bolted into the trees in the opposite direction, abandoning everything. Carter didn't blame him. He'd do the same if he could. Sale ran. Not a stomp. Not a charge. A controlled sprint that ate the lot, crossed the road, and vanished into the forest before the soldier could even fully lift his weapon again. Carter clung to her arm as branches whipped past, pain and cold, and adrenaline mixing into a single roaring line. Behind them, the soldier's radio crackled, shouting now, panicked, loud enough that even Carter could make out fragments. "Contact. Contact. There, she's..." Moving northeast, searchlights flared somewhere through the trees, pale beams slicing between trunks. Rotors surged closer. The hunt had a direction now. Sale didn't slow. Blood ran down her shoulder in a warm line against cold skin. Carter pressed his hand against the wound, automatically trying to stanch it, and she hissed, not in pain, but in irritation at the touch, then relaxed when she realized what he was doing. "You help," she said, breath rough. "Yeah," Carter rasped. "That's kind of my thing, remember?" A sound escaped her, half a snort, half a laugh, feral and fleeting. Then her focus snapped back to the dark ahead. They plunged deeper into the forest, away from the road, away from the brief chance at anonymity. Carter's mind raced. They had a radio, a first aid kit, and now a problem. The facilities teams had a confirmed sighting. They would converge with everything: drones, dogs, thermal, maybe even heavier assets. Carter forced himself to think like the people chasing them. If he were command, what would he do? Box them in, push them toward terrain that favored humans, narrow the escape routes, drive them toward open ground, and if Sail was hurt, force her to choose between speed and safety. Carter looked up at her face, seeing the tension in her jaw, the way she held her injured shoulder slightly stiff. "They shot you," he said, more statement than question. Sail didn't look down. "Yes." "Can you keep running?" "Yes." "You're lying," Carter said, and even through the fear, the smallest edge of grim satisfaction cut through. He'd caught her using his word again. Sail's mouth tightened. "Not bad lie." Carter almost laughed and choked instead. "We need to stop and bandage it." Sail's head snapped down, eyes sharp. "No, stop. They come." "I know," Carter said, forcing urgency into something steady. "But if you bleed out, we're done." "You save me. I save you." "That's not a negotiation." She stared at him for a long second. Then she growled something under her breath and changed direction sharply, veering toward a darker line ahead where the forest dipped. Water. Again. Carter didn't know where she was taking them until the trees opened onto a steep drop and he heard it. The roar of a river, fast and swollen, cutting through the valley like a living saw. Moonlight caught the white water. Mist rose in a low, constant breath. Sail stopped at the edge, crouching, scanning upstream and down. Carter saw what she saw. Rocks, ledges, a narrow section where the river funneled between two boulders. A crossing point. Dangerous. "Perfect. You're going in that?" Carter croaked. Sail looked at him like he'd asked if she could breathe. "Yes." Carter's throat went dry. "We're going to die." Sail leaned close, eyes bright, and said, very softly, "Not fail." Then she stepped off the bank. The cold slammed them. The current grabbed Sail's legs and tried to tear them out from under her. Carter screamed without sound, mouth open in shock, and Sail's arm locked around him like steel. She fought the river with brute strength and smart angles, using rocks as brakes, moving diagonally instead of straight across. Halfway through, Carter saw the beam of a searchlight sweep the far bank, heard a helicopter's rotor wash chopping the mist into sheets. They were being driven right to this. Sail's muscles tensed. She pushed harder. Blood from her shoulder mixed with river water, dark ribbons unwinding downstream. Carter fumbled with the first aid kit one-handed, teeth chattering so hard he could barely see. He found gauze by touch, tore it open with his teeth, and slammed it against the wound, pressing with all the strength he had. Sail hissed and nearly lost footing. Carter clung tighter, pressed harder. "Sorry," he shouted over the river. "I know it hurts." Sail's jaw clenched. "Do." "Not sorry. Do it." He did. They reached the far bank and hauled themselves onto slick rock, Sail dragging Carter up first, then pulling herself out with a grunt that was more fatigue than pain. She stumbled once, just once, and caught herself on a tree trunk so hard the bark splintered. Carter scrambled to his knees, can shaking, and wrapped the gauze tight, then added a strip of torn fabric from his own sleeve. "Hold still," he ordered. Sail glared at him, breathing hard, then, astonishingly, she obeyed. Behind them, the searchlight swept again. Closer. Carter heard voices now, distorted by mist. Dogs barking on the bank they'd just left. "They'll cross," Carter panted. "They'll." Sail shook her head, eyes cutting toward the river. She pointed. The water was too fast, too loud, too dangerous for dogs to track well. It was a reset button. A gap in the chase. But helicopters didn't care about rivers. Carter grabbed the radio, thumbed it on, and held it close to his ear. Static. Then a voice, clear now. "All teams, converge on river sector. Repeat, converge. Asset is injured. Do not let." Another voice cut in, sharp, commanding. "This is Voss. Countermanding. Hold position. Do not fire unless fired upon. Do you copy?" There was a beat of stunned silence, then overlapping chatter, confusion, anger, someone swearing. Then the cold voice returned, cutting through with authority Carter recognized in his bones. Command level, not field. Negative, Voss. You are relieved. Continue engagement. Terminate both targets. That is an order. Carter's blood went colder than the river. Sail leaned close, listening. She understood none of the words and all of the tone. "Voss help?" she asked, rough. Carter swallowed. Voss tried, he rasped. "But someone above her, someone higher, wants us erased." Sail stared into the dark forest ahead. Her eyes narrowed, and the burning anger that had been barely contained at the lot returned, but tempered now by something sharper. Not rage. Resolve. Carter finished the bandage and pulled back, chest heaving. "We can't outrun a helicopter," he said. "Not forever." Sayo looked down at him, then pointed into the trees, deeper, darker, denser. Then she pointed back toward the facility's direction and made a small motion like plucking something out of the air. A plan. Not just run. Carter's mind flickered, trying to keep up. "You want to take something?" he guessed. Sayo's mouth tightened. "Take back." Carter stared at her. "Sayo, that facility." She leaned closer, voice low, and the words came out halting but clear enough to hit like a punch. "They take my people. They take me. They take you." Her hand closed into a fist. "I take back." Carter's stomach dropped with the weight of it. This wasn't just escape anymore. This was war. And she wasn't thinking about surviving the night. She was thinking about ending the hunt. He should have told her no. He should have said it was impossible. He should have pushed her toward running until they found a town, found help, found some corner of the world where a giant alien woman could hide. But he remembered the purge alarms. The command voice on the radio ordering execution. The fact that there was no safe corner while the people behind that voice were still in control. Carter looked up at Sayle's face in the dark, at the fresh bandage soaked through at the edges, at the unwavering focus. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, voice thin. Sayle pointed at the river behind them, then at the sky, then she made a downward slicing motion. "Helicopter down." Carter's eyes widened. "With what?" "Rocks." Sayle's lips curled faintly, and for the first time since the purge, there was something like grim confidence in her expression. She pointed at the forest around them, then mimed pulling, bending, snapping. "Traps." Carter swallowed hard. His fevered brain scrambled through possibilities. Wires. Logs. A choke point. Something heavy enough to hurt a low-flying craft if it came close. Something that would force it to back off, or crash, or at least stop hovering over them like a god. He looked at his own trembling hands. "I don't know if I can." Sayle touched his chest, 2 fingers, firm. "Shoes," she said. Carter breathed in cold river air and tasted the truth. Running forever wasn't a plan. It was just a slower way to die. He nodded once. "Okay," he said. "Then we set the board." Sayle's eyes flared with approval. She turned and moved into the trees, and Carter followed, tethered by nothing now but choice and the thin, terrifying thread of trust they were building while the world hunted them. Above, rotors thumped closer, louder, shaking the leaves. The searchlight began to sweep the valley again, and this time Carter didn't just flinch and hide. He looked up through the branches at the pale beam cutting the night and felt something hard settle into place under his fear. If they wanted a monster, they were going to find out what happened when a cage broke and the thing inside it learned how to plan. Sayle moved like she'd been waiting her whole life for the moment she could stop reacting and start shaping what happened next. She didn't crash through brush anymore. She threaded through it, choosing ground that swallowed footprints and branches that wouldn't snap loud. Carter trailed behind her, half-lined with fatigue, forcing his mind to stay sharp by narrating reality to himself, wind direction, rotor rhythm, the way the searchlight swept in a pattern that implied there were at least 2 birds working the valley. Every time his thoughts drifted, he tasted river water and blood and dragged himself back. They found a fold in the terrain where old storm damage had knocked trees down into a tangled, sunken corridor. The canopy there was thicker, the air stiller, and the ground was soft with rot that would take prints and then blur them with damp. Sayle stopped and pressed her palm against a trunk, eyes closed, listening through wood and soil the way Carter listened through radio static. When she opened her eyes, she pointed, uphill and slightly left. Carter didn't hear anything at first. Then he caught it, not the helicopter, but the faint crunch of boots, human cadence, careful spacing. A sweep line closing. Sayle's jaw tightened. She looked down at Carter, and for a second her gaze wasn't alien or predatory. It was assessing. She was weighing him the way she'd weighed that blast shutter, the way she'd weighed the SUV soldier. How much force? How much risk? How much margin before something breaks? Carter hated that he could feel himself on that scale. "I'm not dead yet," he whispered, like it mattered. Sayle didn't argue. She reached out, and instead of scooping him up, she tapped his shoulder twice, then pointed to a narrow gap under the fallen trunks, just wide enough for a human to slide through, not wide enough for her to follow without making noise. Carter stared at it and understood. A split. Not forever. Just long enough to keep one of them from being a single, easy target. He started to shake his head. No. No separating. Sail's eyes narrowed. Rule, she said, and held up one finger. Then she pointed at the direction of the boots. Then she tapped his chest. Then she made a small, precise motion like placing something carefully down. Hide. Breathe. Live. Then she tapped her own chest and made a gesture like drawing attention, a hand sweeping outward, here. She wasn't asking him to abandon her. She was telling him she was going to pull the thread away from where he would die first. Carter's throat tightened. You get shot again and I can't patch it, he hissed. Sail leaned in close enough that he felt the heat of her breath. No cage, she said, like a vow. Then she touched his forehead gently, too warm, too human for how brutal everything else was. Wait. He didn't want to. He did anyway, because the alternative was a panic spiral that would get them both killed. Carter slid under the fallen trunks into the damp pocket beyond, pressing himself into leaf litter and shadow until he felt ridiculous. He wrapped the thermal blanket around his shoulders, then pulled mud and dead leaves over the reflective surface to dull it. Every motion hurt. His lungs felt too small. He forced himself to breathe through his nose, slow, and listened. The boots drew near. And then Sail moved. She didn't roar. She didn't crash through trees to announce herself. She did something worse. She created presence. A branch snapped in the wrong place. A silhouette shifted where there shouldn't have been one. A brief glint of amber eyes through brush. Enough for human brains to latch onto a story. There. The asset. The monster. The thing you were told to fear. The boots pivoted instantly. Radios crackled. Someone whispered a curse. Carter heard the click of safeties and the soft, tight breathing of men trying not to die. A voice called, low but firm, hold. Hold. Don't shoot unless. Another voice snapped back, we have authorization. Then a dog barked, close, excited, sure. Carter's stomach knotted. He wanted to surge out of hiding and do something, anything. But the log pile above him felt like the weight of Sail's hand, the weight of her weight. He bit down on the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste copper and stayed still. Sail's distraction pulled the line away, and the boots moved off. The voices went with them, drifting deeper into the forest in a slow, cautious surge. The dog's barks faded, then flared again in the distance, redirected. Only then did the helicopter return, louder now, lower, angling into the valley like it had been given a confirmed heading. The searchlight swept over Carter's hiding place once, twice. He squeezed his eyes shut and made himself a stone. The light moved on. Minutes crawled. His fever surged, bringing a haze that tried to wrap him up and carry him away. He clung to the soundscape instead. Rotor thump, distant shouted commands, the strange hush that happened when a group stopped moving and began aiming. Then, somewhere out there, Sail made a sound, brief, sharp, not a scream. Carter's heart lunged. It wasn't pain. It was signal. A heartbeat later, the forest erupted into motion. Men shouting. Dog barking frantic. The helicopter's beam jerking wildly as it tried to track something moving too fast under canopy. Sail had shifted from lure to ghost. Carter couldn't see her, but he could feel the way the chase changed. It wasn't a clean pursuit anymore. It was confusion. People repositioning. Orders getting stepped on. Someone trying to call and coordinates that kept changing because she wasn't running in a straight line. She was cutting across their assumptions. And then the radio chatter Carter had heard earlier echoed faintly through the trees closer than he liked. Someone had moved nearer to his pocket. He caught fragments. Don't lose her, and cut her off, and then the cold voice again, faint, but unmistakably contemptuous, as if it didn't believe in failure. Drive them into open ground. If you must, burn the brush. Carter's blood iced over. Burn. That was how you flushed out something that hid too well. That was how you turned a forest into a funnel. He looked up through the cracks in the log pile and imagined flame licking through dead leaves, smoke filling pockets like his, oxygen turning into poison. He imagined Sail, huge and wounded, trying to run through fire while helicopters boxed her in. He imagined himself coughing into ash, useless. He couldn't stay put. He slid out from under the trunks, moving low and slow, and followed the faintest cues, the direction the boots had gone, the way the helicopter's beam angled, the distant flashes of muzzle light that told him someone had panicked and fired at shadow. He didn't run. He couldn't. He moved like a sick man who had decided that dying in place was no longer acceptable. He found Sail by accident, not skill. A sudden shift of brush. A massive shape crouched behind a boulder, breathing hard, one hand pressed to her bandaged shoulder. Her eyes snapped to him instantly, furious. "No," she hissed. "Wait." Carter panted, pain ripping through his chest. "They said burn," he rasped. "They'll smoke us out. Your plan, whatever it is, it has to happen before they light the woods." Sale's expression sharpened. Her gaze flicked upslope toward the direction of the searchlight, then down toward Carter. For a moment her hands tightened, and Carter thought she was going to grab him and haul him off like a sack just to keep him alive. Instead, she did something that looked like surrender and felt like respect. She nodded. Then she looked at the terrain, river behind, dense timber ahead, the valley narrowing into a natural choke where rock and trees squeezed the path. She pointed to that narrowing corridor and then to the sky. Then she made a downward pressing motion, down, followed by a sweeping motion like pushing something away. Not take it down. Not destruction. Not bloodlust. A forceful rejection. A warning to keep the aircraft back, to make hovering low and confident too risky. Carter swallowed, understanding. You want them to back off, not crash. Sale's eyes held his. "Rule 1, she said, quietly. It sounded like she'd swallowed something sharp to say it. Carter's lungs burned. He nodded. "Okay. Then we scare them. We make them cautious." She moved, and Carter moved with her, the two of them sliding through shadow toward that narrowing corridor. Sale's size became an advantage there. The big trunks and boulders weren't obstacles to her, they were tools. She worked with them in quick, efficient bursts, shifting cover, blocking lines, creating uncertainty, without the kind of meticulous detail that made it feel like a how-to, just the raw logic of survival. Make yourself hard to see, make yourself hard to track, make the hunter doubt. As they reached the choke, the helicopter dipped lower, the searchlight spearing through mist and catching the wet shine of leaves. Carter felt the beam brush them and freeze, like an eye focusing. A voice boomed from above, amplified again, trying to sound calm and failing. "Carter Reed, you are ordered to surrender. Step into the light with your hands visible." Carter stared up through branches, heart hammering. "I don't even know if Reed is my last name anymore," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Sale's gaze snapped to him, confused, then back to the sky. The beam tightened, tracking. The helicopter drifted closer, the rotor wash whipping the treetops into frantic motion. Leaves swirled. Mist tore. The sound was deafening. Sale rose. Not to attack, not to leap, not to throw. She rose to her full height under canopy, letting the helicopter see her silhouette for the first time since the road. A towering, wounded shape in torn white, eyes like embers. She spread her arms slightly, not in surrender, more like a warning. "I am here, and I am not afraid." The helicopter hovered, and the beam locked on her. For a second the entire forest felt held in that light, as if even the animals were holding their breath. Carter's stomach clenched. "Sale, don't." Sale turned her head just enough to look down at him. Her voice dropped, rough and simple. "Choose." Carter swallowed, then stepped forward. Just a little, enough that his shape was visible beside her massive shadow. He raised one hand, palm out, not surrendering, but signaling stop. "I'm here," he shouted up into the roar. "If you fire, you're executing a man who hasn't been charged with anything. You want that on record?" For a heartbeat, the helicopter hesitated. Then the cold voice crackled over radio again, faint but carrying. "Terminate. Now." The beam tightened. The craft dipped lower. And Sale moved, not toward violence, but toward dominance. She drove one foot into the earth hard enough that the ground shuddered, then slammed her palm into a trunk beside her. The tree didn't fall cleanly. It groaned and cracked, pitching in a way that sent a cascade of branches and debris into the airspace the helicopter wanted to occupy. Not a strike. A statement. "You don't own this space." The helicopter lurched up, abruptly, rotor wash screaming louder as the pilot corrected. The searchlight jittered, briefly losing both of them. Carter felt a savage surge of relief until he saw movement between trees. Ground team. Close. Too close. Two soldiers broke through brush, weapons up, eyes wide. They saw Sale. They saw Carter. Their brains did what brains do when they're cornered in a story they were trained to fear. One of them fired. The shot cracked through the forest. Carter flinched, expecting impact. Sale didn't wait for a second round. She stepped forward and put her body between Carter and the muzzle again. This time the bullet bit into her side, a sharp jolt that made her inhale hard through clenched teeth. Her hand snapped out, fast, and she slapped the rifle aside the same way she had in the lot, sending it spinning into the dark. The soldier lunged for his sidearm. Sail grabbed him, not by the throat this time, not by the chest, but by the wrist, and she held. Locked. Immobilized. Painful, yes, but controlled. The soldier cried out, and his partner froze, weapon wavering, suddenly aware that if he fired again he'd hit his own. Carter stepped forward, voice raw. "Stop shooting," he yelled at the second soldier. "You're going to get yourself killed." The soldier's eyes flicked between Carter and Sail, wild with fear. His radio crackled with shouted orders. His grip tightened. Sail's eyes burned. Her breath came harsh. She could end this in one ugly second. Carter grabbed her forearm, feeling the muscle vibrating under his hands like a coiled cable. "Sail," he said, low and urgent, forcing himself into her field of view. "Rule 1. You already did it. You stopped the gun." "You don't have to." Sail stared at him. The ridge of her brow tightened. Her fingers twitched. Then, slowly, she released the soldier's wrist. The man stumbled backward, gasping, clutching his arm like it was broken even if it wasn't. He stared at Sail like she'd just spared him, because she had. The second soldier didn't take the gift. He raised his weapon again, shaking. Carter's voice went cold. "If you shoot her again, she's going to stop you, and it will be your fault. You're not hunting a monster. You're making one." For one beat, the soldier hesitated. That was when the helicopter's searchlight found them again, and with it came the amplified voice, different now, sharper, not pretending anymore. "All units engage." Engage. Carter felt the world tip. There was no negotiation. No restraint. No order Voss could salvage. Sail's head snapped up toward the light, then down to Carter. Her eyes were feral and clear. "We go," she said. And she didn't grab him like property. She grabbed him like a partner in a sprint. They moved together, Sail taking the brunt of the forest, Carter keeping his feet under him because he had to. They plunged into the narrowest, darkest run of trees, where the helicopter couldn't follow low without risking itself, where gunfire was blinded by trunks and panic, where dogs would lose track in churned water and crushed fern. Behind them, the shouts rose into full chaos, and Carter heard it, the crackling hiss of someone starting fire, the ugly snap of ignition. Smoke would come. Sail ran anyway, blood and river water and mud mixing on her skin, and Carter ran because he'd chosen, because she'd listened, because now there was no later to argue about words like mine. There was only the next 50 yards, the next breath, the next patch of darkness where the searchlight didn't reach. And somewhere in the distance, under all the noise, Carter caught a new sound, faint but real, sirens. Not military. Not the facility's alarms. Something civilian, far off on a road. A town. A chance. Carter looked up at Sail's profile as she tore through the night and shouted over the roar, "We head for that. We get to people." Sail didn't answer with language. She answered by turning, ever so slightly, toward the sound, and for the first time, Carter felt the hunt shift from pure flight to something that resembled a destination. The sirens weren't close, still a distant, wavering thread through the trees, but the mere fact they existed changed everything. A town meant noise, motion, eyes. A place where the facility's clean little kill order couldn't happen in silence. It also meant risk, because Sail under streetlights wasn't a rumor anymore. She was a headline. Carter's lungs felt like they were tearing with every breath. His boots were full of river water. His fever turned the world into a jittering film reel, frames skipping, sound lagging, edges warping. But Sail kept a pace that was just barely possible for him, glancing down every few seconds as if she could measure the exact second his body would fail and preempt it. When the ground dropped unexpectedly, her hand closed on his forearm and guided him without slowing. When he stumbled, she didn't yank him back, she adjusted her stride to absorb it, like she'd decided his survival was part of her gait. Behind them, the forest started to smell wrong. Smoke was subtle at first, just a faint sweetness on the air, like distant campfire. Then it thickened into something harsher, acrid, biting. The facility teams weren't flushing anymore. They were committing. Burning brush meant burning everything in the path, animals, old deadfall, the whole valley if that's what it took. The searchlight swung again, lower now, probing the canopy edges. The helicopter couldn't dive into the tight corridor Sail chose, but it didn't need to. It only had to herd them. The beam clipped treetops and left bright scars across leaves. Somewhere behind that light, men shouted coordinates and the cold voice on the net kept saying the same thing in different words. Close the ring, force contact, end it. Sail angled downhill as the sirens grew clearer. Carter started to recognize the cadence. Small town police, maybe EMS, responding to something that had nothing to do with them. or responding because the facility had made a call and spun a story. He hated that part. The invisible part. The part where someone in a clean office could reframe a hunted man into a threat with one sentence. They broke out of thick timber into a stretch of younger trees, thinner trunks, less cover. Carter's heart dropped. The canopy here was patchy, moonlight leaked through. Ahead, through a dip in the terrain, he saw a road, real road, not just a strip of asphalt in the woods. There were lights now, not just orange sodium glow. A flashing blue-red pulse and bright white headlights fanned out like a barricade. A roadblock. Sail saw it too. She stopped so hard Carter nearly ran into her thigh. Her whole body went still, and the air around them felt like it tightened. The sirens were close now, echoing off hills, mixing with rotor thump overhead and the ugly crackle of a fire line moving through brush behind them. Carter crouched instinctively, grabbing Sail's wrist and pulling her down with him. "Okay," he panted, staring through the trees. Okay. We don't go straight in. We skirt it. Sail didn't crouch. She stared at the lights like they were another kind of cage. The roadblock was at a bend where the road cut between two rocky shoulders. 2 police SUVs, maybe 3, with light bars washing the trees in harsh color. A smaller vehicle with hazards on, maybe a ranger truck. And beyond them, partially hidden behind the flashing chaos, a larger dark vehicle with no light bar at all. Too squared off. Too clean. Not local. Carter's stomach twisted. Even from this distance, he could feel the difference between civilian response and contained operation. The stance, the spacing, the way people moved. This wasn't just cops reacting to a call. Someone had arrived with authority and dropped a plan on top of it. Sail made a small sound in her throat, not quite a growl, and Carter felt her muscles coil. She was thinking the simplest thought in the world. Smash through. Carter grabbed her forearm harder. "No," he hissed. "No, Sail, listen. If we go out there, they'll shoot you in front of." He cut himself off, because the word people felt flimsy. Witnesses. Cameras. Kids in back seats. Somebody with a phone. In front of everyone. Sail's head turned down slowly. Her eyes were bright and fierce and wounded all at once. "They take," she said, voice low. "Not a fear. A certainty." "I know," Carter rasped. "But if we turn this into a spectacle, we lose whatever chance we have to control the story." She held his gaze, and he could see the war happening inside her. Instinct versus learning, survival versus rage. The thing she'd been built into versus the thing she was trying to become. Carter forced himself to point at the roadblock again. "We need a gap. A moment. Something that lets us pass without you being obvious." Sail stared at him like he'd asked her to become smaller. Then she looked toward the fire glow behind them, the faint orange smear rising through trees. The smoke was thicker now, crawling low. The hunt was pushing. If they stayed here, they'd be bracketed between flame and floodlight. Sail's jaw clenched. She touched Carter's chest, 2 fingers, and then she touched her own. Then she made a motion like pressing down, compressing. A new gesture. New meaning. Hide. Together. Carter swallowed. "How?" Sail turned, scanning the terrain like a machine with a purpose. Her gaze landed uphill on a dark shape against the slope. A culvert entrance, an old drainage tunnel under the road, half hidden by brush and rock. Not huge. Not designed for her. But it was there, a hollow vein beneath the human world. She pointed. Carter squinted, then nodded sharply. Okay, yes. That could." He stopped when Sail began moving toward it, because the tunnel looked barely big enough for Carter to crawl through without scraping his shoulders raw. Sail reached the mouth of the culvert, crouched, and pressed her hand against the concrete rim. She tested it once like testing a door. Then she started to widen it. Not by smashing, not by collapsing the road, by peeling away the earth around it and cracking loose the concrete edge with careful force, controlled enough that the road above didn't shudder. Carter watched, stunned, as she made room the way a surgeon makes an incision, fast, brutal, but precise. You could have done that the whole time. Carter breathed, half accusation, half awe. Sail shot him a look that said, "I did what I needed to." The smoke behind them thickened again, and with it came a new sound, closer voices, closer boots, dogs barking in frantic, staccato bursts. The pursuit line was almost at the tree line behind them. Carter didn't wait. He dropped to the ground and wriggled into the culvert first, dragging the first aid kit and the radio with him. The concrete was cold and slimy, water trickling along the bottom. It stank of algae and rust and old decay. He forced himself to crawl anyway, elbows scraping, knees sliding in shallow water. Behind him, Saya lowered herself to the entrance. For a second he thought she wouldn't fit, even with what she'd done. Then her shoulder pressed into the opening, and the entire tunnel groaned like it was protesting a violation of its purpose. Carter heard concrete grind, felt vibrations through his ribs. Sale hissed, not in pain, but in concentration, and shoved forward. The tunnel darkened completely as her body blocked the mouth. Carter crawled faster, panic spiking. Sale, if this collapses, it won't, she said, blunt and immediate, as if that was a fact she could enforce. Above them, through the thin ceiling of concrete and earth, Carter heard the roadblock in a way he hadn't before. Muffled voices, boots on asphalt, someone shouting something that sounded like "hold the line." The sirens pulsed overhead like a heartbeat in the world above. The helicopter's rotors thudded nearer, and the searchlight swept across the road. Carter could tell because the muffled voices shifted into sharper, urgent tones. Then new sound, a sharp metallic rattle overhead, followed by a distant barked command that made the hairs on Carter's neck rise. Thermals picking up movement near the culvert. Carter's blood turned to ice. He froze mid-crawl, water trickling under his chest. Sale stopped behind him, filling the tunnel with her heat and shadow. Her breath was suddenly very quiet, controlled, listening. The voices above grew louder as people moved closer to the edge of the road, near the culvert entrance. Carter could hear boots repositioning, the clack of something being handled, maybe a rifle, maybe a flashlight, maybe something worse. A beam of light stabbed down from the culvert's far end. Someone had swung the flashlight toward the opposite opening, the one Carter hadn't reached yet. The tunnel ahead lit up in a pale cone, and Carter saw the wet concrete gleam like bone. He swallowed, throat tight. If someone looked in from the far side, they'd see him. If someone dropped something into the tunnel, there would be nowhere to go. If Sale surged forward, the tunnel might hold, or it might not. Sale's hand touched Carter's ankle, gentle, a signal rather than a grab. "Stop," she mouthed, then pointed ahead. Carter forced himself to crawl again, faster toward the far opening. The flashlight beam held steady, probing, searching. He could hear someone on the far side breathing, close enough now that it didn't sound muffled. A person was crouching at the exit, peering in. Carter's heart hammered so hard he thought it might betray him through sound alone. Then a voice from above, near the entrance behind them, shouted something sharp and excited. "I've got eyes." The sentence cut off. Not with a gunshot. Not with a scream. With the sudden, sickening thud of a body hitting the ground, hard, and the startled chorus of people reacting. Carter froze again, mid-crawl, eyes wide in the thin light. Sale went utterly still behind him. Above, chaos blossomed, shouting, running, radios crackling, someone yelling for a medic. The flashlight at the far end wavered, jerked away as the person there turned their attention toward the commotion. Carter stared at the far opening, then at the flickering light, then back into the darkness behind him where Sale's amber eyes glinted like coals. "What did you do?" he whispered, barely audible. Sale didn't answer. Above, the cold voice cut through the radio chatter again, clearer now, closer, angry. "Seal the exits. Now. Do not let them." A new sound joined the chaos overhead, the unmistakable click and whine of something heavy being readied. Not a rifle, not a flashlight. Something mechanical. Something meant to end uncertainty. Carter's stomach dropped as realization hit him like a punch. They weren't going to crawl in after them. They were going to flush the tunnel. Carter opened his mouth to warn Sale, and the tunnel suddenly flooded with a harsh white beam as the far side light snapped directly onto him, locking in place like an eye that had finally found what it wanted. Contact. Someone screamed from the far opening. Carter's blood went cold. He couldn't move forward without exposing himself. He couldn't move back because Sale filled the tunnel behind him. And above them, whatever was being readied made its final, hungry whine. Sale's hand tightened around his ankle, not pulling him back, not pushing him forward, just holding him there as if she could keep him from vanishing. Her voice came low and fierce in the darkness right behind him. "Choose," she said again. And before Carter could answer, the concrete under his palms began to tremble.